Okay, so first of all, welcome to the event. Welcome to this workshop on children and artificial intelligence. Before we get properly started, I'll just make a few housekeeping points. If you're here in the audience, please keep your cameras and microphone off during the event while people are speaking. You can ask questions throughout the course of the talks through the chat functionality. This event will be recorded on Zoom and available to view afterwards on the CRASSH website. So if you do switch on your camera or your microphone, you may be included in the final recording. So that's why best to keep it off if you're happy. Otherwise, you're providing your consent to be recorded. In addition, there will be a short feedback questionnaire sent out after the session via Eventbrite, and we'd really appreciate it if you could fill that in for us. Live captioning is also enabled. You can find this at the bottom of your screen, but as always, the accuracy of automatic captioning is not perfect, and so CRASSH is not liable for any inappropriately generated transcripts. So first of all, my name is Shauna Concannon, and welcome to this event. We're really excited to have you all here with us today, and we've got some really interesting speakers who are coming from different angles, different perspectives, using different methodologies, but to work on questions surrounding children and how they are engaging with different types of artificially intelligent systems increasingly. This event is hosted by CRASSH, the Centre for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities at the University of Cambridge, and is organised by the Giving Voice to Digital Democracies project with support from the Humanities and Social Change International Foundation. A little note on the project. So the Giving Voice to Digital Democracies project looks at the societal and ethical impacts of artificially intelligent communication technologies. This kind of conceived quite broadly to think about any sort of language-based system, from hate speech detection through to virtual personal assistants. And we're an interdisciplinary group of researchers from philosophy, linguistics, computer science, and engineering. And part of what we do is organising events like this, really, where we can bring together diverse groups of people with different disciplinary experts from industry, policy, and academic perspectives to try and foster more conversation on these important issues of how technology is impacting on how society is developing. So the aim of this workshop really is to provide a space to share innovative approaches for designing, evaluating, and regulating language-based AI technologies for children and young people. And it explores, I hope that we'll have lots of conversation and lots of discussion around this so that we can think about the very different ways in which these systems are impacting on the lives of children and young people. And, I think, as we're all aware, young people are already engaging with systems in a variety of different ways, different use contexts from within the home, for social purposes, educational purposes, etc. And I think that bringing together all of you here today should allow us to really drill down to think through this in a bit more context. A little bit of overview for the schedule. This first session will run from 1:30 till 3 p.m. Then we'll have a half-hour break. You're welcome to stay in the room. The Zoom room will stay open. And then we'll be back for the final session from 3:30 to 5:15. That's all British summer time timings. This first session focuses on children's interactions with AI systems, and the speakers will be presenting case studies and projects that provide insights into specific application areas and emergent topics. So it should give us an opportunity to explore best practice when designing language-based AI systems and learning experiences for and with children. So we've got a range of different methodologies, different kind of application areas, but it should give us a good starting point of practical implementation and practical challenges. And then the second session, we'll build on this to start thinking about what's necessary for future directions that we might need to think about. So each speaker will present for about 10 minutes. I'll introduce each speaker and we'll have all of the talks first, and then we'll have the Q&A and discussion afterwards. So if you have questions, as mentioned before, please put them into the chat and we'll revisit them at the end of all the talks. So let us get started. Our first speaker today is Micol Spitale. They're a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Cambridge, and they work in the Affective Intelligence and Robotics Laboratory. Her research focuses on conversational technologies for children with cognitive disabilities and the use of social robots to convey emotion for children with neurodevelopmental disorders. And her doctoral thesis addressed the application of conversational, socially assistive robots for assessing and training in linguistic skills of children, particularly children with autistic spectrum disorder. So I will hand over to Micol now, and I'll stop sharing the screen.
Thank you so much for the nice introduction. Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen? Okay, great. Okay, so first of all, thank you for inviting me to give this presentation. I'm going to present one of the study that I've been running during my PhD, and which main focus is on conversational agent for children with language impairments. So during my PhD, I've been investigating different conversational technologies, starting from intelligent personal assistants such as Alexa, Google Home, and up to social assistive robots. So conversational agent that has some kind of embodiment, and on those technology has been applied with children with language impairments. First of all, I would like to acknowledge that this work is the outcome of a collaboration with a multidisciplinary research group, because of course, for all the activities that address linguistic skills, we have collaborated with psycholinguistics. So they provide us with the activity, to measure and assess and also train the linguistic skills of children with the language impairment. Let me provide you a brief overview of our target population. So who children with language impairment are? Basically, children with language impairment include children with the developmental language disorder, but also children with autism spectrum disorder with language impairment. So basically, we are considering our target group as an intersection between children with the neurodevelopmental disorder that are usually characterized by relational, social, and also communication problems and issues. While on the other side, we have, generally speaking, children with language shortcomings. So we try to address the target population that include, let's say, the intersection between those two target group. We decided to focus specifically on those kind of children because they show that they have similar phenotypic characteristics. So basically, even if a child has been diagnosed by developmental language disorder, so basically they have a primary language impairment, they show sometimes also some difficulties in terms of social and also relational capabilities, because of course having some issues with their language affect also their relational and communication skills. On the other side, we have the autism spectrum disorder children with language impairment that has as primary diagnosis autism, so difficulties in relations and social skills mainly, but they are also accompanied, they are also associated with a language impairment. So basically, we are trying to address this target population because they show very similar behavior, even if they have as different diagnoses. So which are the main difficulties of those children? They usually have many difficulties to express and communicate their thoughts and feelings. So they really have a hard time in express themselves. Then usually they have also some negative outcome in terms of academic performances. So for example, from education and more learning point of view, they have also some difficulties in that regard, because of course the language, their difficulties in language affect also their academic performances. Then of course this is like imply other many difficulties in their life, also in their future life. For example, they have also reduced possibility of employment, they have reduced self-sufficiency and autonomy, and so all those elements impact their everyday life. So what we have trying to do is trying to find a way to overcome their everyday life difficulty, and usually this has been done by a therapeutic intervention that allows them to improve their skills in terms of social skills or relational skills, but have been shown that the traditional therapy has a lot of limitation. So the main limitation that we have identified were three. The first one is that the World Health Organization pinpoints that the traditional therapeutic intervention lack of attractiveness and engagement. There are a lot of barriers in terms of long-term engagement and access of this kind of therapeutic intervention and practice, and there is not a joint perspective between the training of linguistic skills paired with extra linguistic skills. So basically the therapeutic intervention just focus on trying to train their linguistic skills by themselves without focusing on other important aspects of children communication, for example, more relational or emotional skills. For this reason, I've been shown in literature that the technologies has a lot of potential to try to address those limitations and try to overcome those. So the technology, first of all, they allow children to be attracted, engaged, and so that make more the therapeutic intervention more comfortable for them. And the technology allow a continuum between the clinical practice and the home environment, for example, because technology provide some platform, for example, web-based application that can be also exploited not only during the therapeutic intervention themselves, but also in an home context. And of course, they allow also to train other aspects of the communication and relational skills of children, and not just focusing on the linguistic ones. So we identify as one of the most promising technology the conversational agents. Conversational agents are software that are able to understand the user request via natural language processing and respond to it. So all of you are used to, I guess, Google Home or Alexa, so you can, you can prompt the system with some questions, some requests, and the system is replying you accordingly, understanding what you are saying. And we are trying to do exactly the same, but for children with language impairment, because it has been shown that they are really attracted and engaged by this kind of technology. So as I mentioned before, we try to address all the traditional limitation, the traditional therapy limitation with conversational agent. But let's focus on, the main research question that drive our research study, specifically the empirical study that I'm going to share with you today. So we wonder if children with language impairments could significantly improve their linguistic skills using conversational agent. And then we wonder what is the difference between social assistive robot that basically are conversational agent embodied in a physical robot, and embodied conversational agent that are virtual agent that can be embedded in web apps, so you can interact with them via mobile devices, for example, tablet or mobile phone or whatever. So, and also one of the main points that I would like to stress with this presentation is that the technology is not designed to substitute the therapist, but the idea is to use the technology, so the conversational agent, as a tool that has been provided to the therapist to help them and support them during the intervention, to make the practice, the therapeutic practice, more appealing. So we also included the therapist in the loop of our empirical study, and we try to, gather their perspective on both technology, but also, generally speaking, what they envision about the future of conversational agent for therapeutic application. So we recruit 23 children with the developmental language disorder and autism spectrum disorder, and 6 therapists. And we run a between subject study where half of the participants have been randomly assigned to the social assistive robot condition. So half of them interact with the physical robot, and the other half has been randomly assigned to the virtual agent condition. And the study lasts 6 or 8 weeks according to the linguistic skills that have been addressed during the training. Of course, we measure the linguistic skills with a pre-test and a post-test to measure what was the improvement of their linguistic skills after the training and after the study. And we ran a group interview and questionnaire to collect and gather all the information from therapists as well. So as I mentioned before, it was a between subject study. In this picture, you can see the social assistive robot on the left, that is like a physical robot, it's a cute one, and embodied conversational agent that is exactly the same appearance of the physical robot, but on a digital version of it. And so the protocol, as I mentioned before, is lasts from 6 to 8 weeks according to linguistic skills that has been addressed, because basically the main idea is that we identify with the help of psycholinguistics the most difficult structure of language that are difficult to learn, that are, for example, WH question and relatives, and the easiest one that are passive and clitics. And so according to the score of the children, we assign the children to the most difficult structure training or the easiest one in order to provide them with the activity that really helps them to train and learn from the training. Our findings show that actually the technology enabled children to significantly improve their linguistic skills. And that was a very, very interesting result. And the social assistive robot have been shown to be the most promising tool because they facilitate social and communication skills beside the linguistic ones, according to the therapist. Then therapists perceive that children engage more with the social assistive robot with respect to the embodied conversational agent, because they perceive that children consider the robot as a peer, as a companion, while they consider the virtual agent as a character in the activity. So they have a totally different perception because of the embodiment matters in the interaction. But on the other side, they show still a big skepticism in the introduction of those technology into speech language therapy, because they believe that those technology can help children to stay engaged, motivate, and positive, but they do not think, besides the result, that they can allow children to improve their skills. So I think that this is a very important point to think and reason about, because it's like interesting findings, and it's important to keep the therapists in the loop to make them aware of the potentiality of the technology, in my opinion. So basically, I think that the main outcome of this study is that the social assistive robots are a suitable technology to help children improving their linguistic skills. And it has been shown that it's also the most promising technology for children with language impairments. So thank you so much for your attention, and I will be happy to, answer any question.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Micol. That was really, really interesting. And as I said, put your questions into the chat function, and we can come back to them. And we're going to stick with the human-robot interaction theme now as we move on to Katiewinkle, who will be our next speaker. So Katie is a postdoctoral research fellow at KTH Stockholm and also assistant professor at Uppsala University. And her work focuses also on human-robot interaction and specifically examining how robots can have a positive impact when deployed into real-world environments. And thinking about what effective human-robot interaction looks like, as including ethical risks and opportunities posed by this. And I think in today's talk, she'll be talking about the sort of co-design processes of developing robots with teenagers. So I will hand over the floor to you now.
Perfect, thank you. Slides look okay? Yeah, great. All right, so yes, I'm going to talk a little bit about the work I'm doing towards kind of trustworthy child-robot interaction. And luckily for me, if I can make my slides move, Nicole already just gave a great introduction to this idea of what socially assistive robots are. And she, as she pointed out, one of the big application cases we see for these robots is with children. So my work is a little bit about, okay, if that's the case, if robots really are going to be filling these gaps between therapists, what do we need to be thinking about if we want to make sure these interactions are trustworthy? And this is a concept we can argue about, but let's say we want to make them trustworthy, and how we can actually do that in real world interactions. So what do we need to think about, and how can we deliver that from a kind of engineering and computer science perspective? So the first kind of research strand I want to talk to you about a little bit is the idea about robot role models, and potentially bad robot role models. And so this work that I've been doing was really inspired by the 2019 UNESCO report, I'd Blush If I Could. And that report, if you haven't seen it, talked a lot about the kind of risks posed by gendered AI systems. So it talked about Siri, Alexa, and how these are ostensibly female agents, and how these agents could be contributing to the continued gender skills divide we see in information technology subjects. So the report criticized Alexa, Siri, Google Home as propagating harmful norms about women, because they take on these subservient, tolerant, and even quite flirty personas that you can kind of use and abuse with no consequence. And for some people, these agents, Alexa, Siri, are actually the face of women in technology, right? Everyone knows Alexa the same way that everyone knows Steve Jobs. Very few people can name a successful real woman in technology. And so if this is what people think women in tech look like, these subservient, flirty personas that you can use and abuse, no problem at all. What does that say to young girls about the technology industry and their place in it, right? It's no wonder people are not being interested in technology when that's how it looks like. So some of my work at KTH was around what happens if we subvert that norm. There's this norm that's what female agents looks like. What would happen to people's perception of a robot, a female robot specifically, if instead it fought back a little bit? If it was a bit sassy, a bit cheeky, what would it do to people's perception of a robot? So we set up a video-based study where high schoolers here in Sweden saw this overtly feminized robot trying to encourage them to study robotics. And in the video, when the robot says, girls, I would especially like to work with you, a male actor in the video says something rather rude, some sexist comment that high school teachers in Sweden here say, yes, this is the kind of nonsense that you still hear in the classroom. And so we showed students this video and showed 3 different versions of robot responses to that. So we had a control condition where the robot said, I won't respond to that. That's what Siri says right now. One of 2 responses Siri says right now if you say something mean to it. We had an argument-based response where the robot kind of said, well, no, actually, gender balancing is important for these reasons. Or we had an aggressive response where the robot was again a bit cheeky and kind of said, no, you're the idiot. I wouldn't want to work with you anyway. And we wanted to see what young people made of these responses as potential ways to deal with the inappropriate behavior that we know goes on in schools. So what we saw from this is that boys' perception of the robot didn't really vary. So these different responses didn't seem to change what boys thought about the robot. But for the girls, the robot that provided this argument-based response, this idea, no, gender balanced teams actually make better robots, the girls perceived that version of the robot as being much more credible, leading us to think that in a use case like this, such a design would be much better at encouraging them to study robotics. So seeing as we had a positive impact on the girls' impressions of the robot with no negative impact on the boys' perception of the robot, this provides some good initial motivation that designing these different types of female robot is actually not only more ethical in that we're no longer propagating these harmful norms, but it could actually make such robots more effective, more engaging. And so actually we should challenge the idea that no, we need to have these subservient female agents because that's what people like. No, we don't need to be doing that anymore. But this was just an initial piece of work and really starts to raise questions about what behaviors our robots, our conversational agents, our gendered AI is intentionally or unintentionally perhaps role modeling for the people around it. You know, what behaviors are we demonstrating? What are we saying is okay or not okay? And how can and should robots call out inappropriate behavior? If robots are going to be in schools, on the playground, what should they do when they see something like this? What does it mean for the children around them if they do or do not respond to this kind of behavior? And I think there's both risks and opportunities in this space, and I think that's something we're going to have to think about more going forward. And then the second bit of work I want to talk to you briefly about is along this idea of teen-in-the-loop robot development. So during my PhD, very much in line with what Nicole was also saying, it's obvious that we should be learning from human experts, right, in contexts like education, in healthcare. Obviously, therapists, teachers have a lot to give. And so I got interested during my PhD in using in situ machine learning to let domain experts teach robots what to do in real time. So in this case, we worked with a fitness instructor, figured out what a robot should be able to do, put it in a gym and let him teach it by telling it what to do and when until the robot could learn autonomously. So when we see the UNICEF guidance saying, yep, we need to be bringing teens in, young people into the development of robot systems, then an obvious question is, can we do this with teens? Would teenagers take on the role of domain experts in robot development? Would they create sensible robots, or would they simply have, create fun robots that do the wrong thing and just basically spam our robots with bad behavior? So last year, I did a 2-week sort of summer school research study where we invited 16 teenagers between ages of 12 to 15 to work with us on the design of a group assistant robot. So the only design brief was, okay, we want to design a robot that's going to make your group interactions better. And after a couple of days of co-design, thinking about how a robot could do that, this is the output. So we had a robot there on the table, and you can see the teen on the left is controlling the robot via a tablet, giving it those training exemplars. Here's what to do when. And the teen on the right is watching, kind of marking how the group is doing. And so that's another form of training data and sort of evaluation we can take. And what we found is that no, participants didn't spam the robot to teach it the wrong thing. For the groups who struggled with group work, they really used the robot as kind of a turn-taking manager to help them take turns. For those who were a bit shy, the robot was a good icebreaker. However, or in addition, groups did use it sometimes to inject some fun into the group. And that was actually seemingly really important for achieving this design goal of making group interactions better. This fun behavior, combined with the fact that they knew it was their friends, their peers themselves that were teaching this robot, that were generating this autonomous behavior, it was really important for their acceptability of the robot. They were very clear on telling us, no, we grown-up researchers would not be able to do this without them. And in addition, this teaching process where they were kind of working with us to design the robot and teach it, it seemingly had a really large impact on their understanding of AI, of machine learning, because it was a really tangible example, right, of how humans create training examples and machines learn from them. And so it led to very natural discussions between us and the young people about bias, about fairness, around where bias comes from. And so this was a really exciting piece of work that I'm kind of excited to take further. And the questions that one raises is, okay, we can kind of see this good potential for Teenintheloop. You know, they are sensible co-designers. They do good stuff. And actually, they seem to create things that we'd probably miss, actually, if we were only working with teachers and adults who might be a bit more focused on the, you know, oh, you just have to do all your work. You know, they might not have thought about this more fun element that was actually crucial to the teens working well together. Really interested in this robot co-creation as a two-way teaching process. So teaching AI teaches you about AI, and there's some very nice mutual shaping to go on there. But moving forward, of course, what we want to explore is how can expert child and adult perspectives be merged in this kind of approach to AI so that we can unlock the best of both worlds, so to say. Okay, that's me up. So I will already hand over. Thank you. And I look forward to the questions at the end.
Thanks, Katie. That was great. Okay, so we've had two very interesting talks on focusing on human-robot interaction, and we're going to move to a slightly different application area here in a different context. So our next speaker today is Nayana Prakash. Nayana is a PhD researcher at the Oxford Internet Institute, where her thesis focuses on storytelling platforms in India. And she's been involved in several projects examining the impact of the internet and technology on society, and particularly attending to marginalized voices online and in society and how these are factored in. And she has published on issues around platforms, responsibilities and impact, and co-authored on topics such as children and misinformation, which she will be talking to us about today. So I will hand this over, I will hand over now to Nayana and yeah, give you the floor. Nayana, I can't seem to.
Yes.
Oh yeah, perfect.
Sorry. Can you hear me and can you see my screen now?
I can see your screen and I can hear you. Yeah.
Great. Sorry, I was on mute.
No worries.
Okay. Let me just actually get my video up as well, if that's at all possible. Okay, well, thank you so much for doing this. I'm, as Shauna mentioned, I'm doing something slightly different. So presenting to misinformation and children and storytelling as a potential solution for that. So a lot of this presentation is based on a paper that I co-authored last year for UNICEF on digital misinformation and disinformation in children. You can find that online and the title will be at the end of this presentation. But before we go into kind of the meat of the presentation, I just wanted to go through these quick myths. And the reason I'm doing this is because this comes up in a lot of times that I've presented about this. So one major point in this presentation is, you know, children themselves are not the main producers of mis and disinformation. So even though there's a lot of concern about the impact misinformation has on children, a lot of that is valid. It's really important for me to say that children are not the main reason why misinformation, disinformation exists. Of course, they can be susceptible to it and they can share it, but it's not of, you know, they're not the main content creators. And another kind of myth related to children and misinformation is the term digital natives. It's often applied to children, and it's often meant to show that children have a much greater sense of how to use technology than adults do, especially perhaps their parents. Now, in some ways, this is true. A lot of children and young people have grown up with technology. They have a great sense of how to use it. You know, they might be the go-to tech support in their family, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they have a sense of, for example, the impact of something like digital privacy. It doesn't necessarily mean that they know the consequences of what they're doing online. And it also kind of oversimplifies the relationship young people may have with technology in settings across the world. And for my presentation and for our UNICEF report, a really important factor is considering the impact of different identities that children may have and how that impacts their relationship with things like misinformation, why some children are more vulnerable to it, and what governments can do. Okay, so why do we focus on children at all if children maybe aren't the main creators of misinformation? So one of the main reasons is that children are uniquely vulnerable to their parents' beliefs. We saw with COVID-19 that if parents, for example, were vaccine hesitant, it would have a huge impact on children. a lot of children, especially younger children, don't have a great deal of autonomy in terms of shaking off what their parents believe. And so children can be victims of misinformation, even if they're not producing it. Misinformation, like many things, also exploits parents' natural protectiveness around children. And I think society's natural protectiveness or conservativeness around children, which may make people make more rational or different decisions than if they were, talking about adults and working with adults. As I mentioned, children from disadvantaged or migrant communities, children from ethnic minority backgrounds may be susceptible to misinformation because they may not share, for example, the main language of their country, or we've all kind of seen that things like anti-migrant rhetoric is really prominent in the media, whether or not it relates to misinformation, but there obviously is a lot of misinformation around it. So children like these are often the subjects of misinformation themselves. And in communities which feel disenfranchised from the government, then there's a really strong ability to trust misinformation as well. But as just to echo something that Katie was saying in her presentation, bringing children into the loop, or teenagers more accurately into the loop, that does have an enormous potential to change the narrative on mis and disinformation, because children do have a sense of tech ability, because children are the kind of leaders of tomorrow when it comes to technology and politics. So just to focus very quickly on a case study that we looked at briefly when we were just writing this report. This was an article on the BBC about misinformation. And it was a BBC article which focused on vaccine hesitancy and associated effects in a British Pakistani community in Bradford in England. So this was when schools were reopening again after having been shut for quite a long time. Sorry?
I don't know what that was. I think it was just some background noise. Carry on.
Okay, yeah. This was when schools were shut for quite a long time and they were reopening again. And some parents in this British Pakistani community were hesitant to let their children go back to school because they believed that they'd be quarantined by the school. And this was due to a viral video that was circulating, which featured a doctor who was speaking in Urdu. Now, this kind of spoke to the fact that a lot of members of this community felt, they had like low faith in the government because there'd been so much back and forth with the government's policy. They also felt a kind of, they felt disenfranchised and undervalued by the government. This was around the time that Eid, that there was lockdown during Eid, which meant that a lot of communities couldn't celebrate. However, that was the kind of lockdown was lifted for Christmas, which suggested that perhaps there was an undervaluing of Muslim communities in this. And it also spoke to the fact that many communities, English is not their first language, and government policy needs to reflect the fact that people may not be fully fluent in English or may have other languages that they're more, they're more comfortable in. So looking at this, we were kind of thinking about why, why this had such an impact on this community. And it spoke to the fact that misinformation preys on already disadvantaged communities. And in this case, the concept of children being withheld from their parents and not being allowed to return home if they got COVID at school, used children as a tool to generate emotion, even if we know that perhaps something doesn't 100% add up. It's a lot of parents are willing to make more drastic decisions when it comes to their children. So why do children, if they, who do share misinformation and disinformation, do so? Well, many of the reasons are the same as for adults. So one is that, misinformation can be really fun. Misinformation is exciting. Misinformation is really, novel, and sometimes it can seem funny to us. Sometimes it can seem like it's satire, and the line between what's satire and what's misinformation and what's funny and what's harmful is it's quite a hard one even to grasp for me as an adult. And their parents might believe it, and we've seen that a lot with political misinformation, that children are more likely to believe it when their parents are talking about it, because children have a lot of faith in their parents. And finally, there is a growing lack of faith in news media and journalism as a profession, and we've seen that the historic kind of gatekeeping of these professions has changed a lot as we get more citizen journalism, and that can be a good thing, but it can also mean that it's more difficult to verify sources. It can also mean that children and adults have less faith, for example, in things like you know, in major publications like the New York Times, or in the concept of journalism at all. And now a question that I think a lot of people want to know the answer to with relation to misinformation is, are social media platforms to blame? So there are there's no kind of straight answer to this, and certainly in this presentation, it wouldn't be possible for me to answer it. But to a great extent, yes, misinformation has always existed. Social media makes it so much easier to spread, and the linking of social media, the ability to share something very quickly from Facebook to WhatsApp, for example, can mean that it's very easy to share things very quickly without necessarily reading them or engaging with them. A lot of people think about answers to misinformation as being related to, you know, taking content down or flagging content once it's been posted, but we can also think of platforms as needing better curation as well as moderation. And what that means is, for example, if we think of social media as like a shop or an art gallery, where are things, you know, how easily accessible are some pieces of information? What do we see when we first enter a platform? What would we only see if we asked for it? And I think that kind of concept and that metaphor of social media as being like a gallery is a really important one to consider. But fundamentally, I think a lot of researchers in this field believe that social media platforms aren't solely to blame because societal problems play out online. You know, issues of race and racism or misogyny or you know, anti-immigrant sentiment, these play out online as well, and these are societal problems. So young people who feel disenfranchised turn to misinformation, and perhaps when they're unsatisfied with the answers that they're getting, or perhaps the answers that they're not getting from governments or institutions. So the power of storytelling isn't something that features heavily in our paper, but it's something that I think about a lot with regards to my PhD. So this is something that can apply to adults as well as to children. And I think that, you know, storytelling is a particularly valuable concept in this because stories are so important to our social and emotional development. When we think about how we learned morality when we were younger, when we think about the impact of religious, you know, storytelling, of social storytelling, of governmental storytelling, the impact of certain figures in our lives, you know, how activism centers around sharing stories, we can see that stories have been really important to our development as people. And I think that, you know, misinformation is itself a kind of story, and perhaps the only way to counter it is by telling true stories, or by telling, or the power of truth telling, truth through stories. In this next slide, I just got a few examples of the growing kind of impact, I suppose, of children's stories that focus on ideas of, you know, sharing concepts and sharing narratives from different backgrounds. So we have here, we have La Frontera, which is a story about undocumented migrants crossing the border into the US. We have activist stories. We have a story about Malala, a story, The Boy Who Asked Why, is based in India and is about Indian activism. And this kind of concept of children's stories, these are very, I guess, this is like one example of storytelling, and there's so many more that unfortunately I don't have time to go into during this. But I think for children, especially, for whom storytelling is actually a really important part of their educational development and their daily routine, it can be really, really effective. And I just want to think of that quote briefly, which I think is one that really neatly sums up the impact of narrative and storytelling, from Francesca Paletta. So finally, just to think of the key points, I guess, in my presentation, children share misinformation, but not main producers. Misinformation is built on stories, and stories can be changed. We can tell new stories. We should tell different stories. But we can't just rely on stories to alter the realities that children face. You know, children and adults face deep societal inequalities, and children, like adults, are afraid. It's been, you know, an uncertain, a troubling, and a difficult decade or so. And these kind of problems won't just go away with us trying to alter the narrative online. We need to be altering the narrative in person as well. And I want to echo a point made earlier about only by working with children, understanding their fears, understanding what they believe, what they don't believe, can we really understand how to work against mis and disinformation, which impacts them. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Feel free to reach out, and if you're interested in the report, that is the title of it over there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nayana. That was great. Okay, so yep, so we just heard a little bit about a nice distinct use case, which I think really emphasizes the importance about thinking of the socio-technical aspects of how we approach some of these challenges and issues, and again drawing on how we think about integrating child perspectives, perhaps the importance of AI literacy strategies and education, as well as technical and other approaches to address these. So next up we have our final speaker of the session, Melanie Penagos, will be speaking to us. So Melanie is an independent consultant and was the project manager on the AI for Children UNICEF project, which Nayana actually mentioned, and is the co-author of the draft policy guidance on AI for children, or the policy guidance on AI for children published by UNICEF, which promotes the inclusion of children's rights in government and private sector AI policies and practice. So, and she was previously a research analyst at the Data and Society Research Institute, where she also analysed the human rights impacts of AI and co-authored the report on digital identity in migration and refugee context. So Melanie's going to be talking to us about the UNICEF work, the policy guidance on AI and children, and I'll hand over the floor to you now.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks. Yeah, I think you're just pulling up the PowerPoint.
I am indeed, yep, sorry, one moment.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay.
Perfect. Okay, thanks. Yeah, so just to start, thank you so much for the invitation to speak with you today. So as Shauna mentioned, we're just going to be giving a brief overview about UNICEF's AI for Children project. And thank you to Katie actually for giving a little bit of a shout out to this work in your presentation. I'll talk a little bit more about inclusion kind of later on in my presentation. So to start, the project was a 2-year initiative. It ran until late last year, and it was sponsored by the government of Finland. The goal of the project overall was to try to better understand how AI systems and policies can enable the realization of child rights for all children. So to help respond to this question, we conducted a literature review of national AI strategies from governments all around the world. And we discovered that overall in these documents, there were very few mentions of children or their needs. In many cases, we found that children were not explicitly addressed because in the text, they were often grouped together and sort of considered as part of society as a whole or as citizens. However, we know that children require special protections and that they have distinct rights and that their developmental phases need to be recognized and accounted for. And there is a lot of research that shows us how children are being impacted by AI in positive and negative ways, and that these technologies will continue to have a profound effect on children's lives now and in the future, especially as AI has both direct and indirect impacts. So even if a child is not directly using an AI-powered system, we know that an algorithm, for example, may still facilitate decision-making that will ultimately impact their life. So this is really a pivotal moment to try to influence the development of AI policies and systems. So with the support of our partners, we organized a series of regional workshops with about 200 digital and child rights experts. And we also held consultations with nearly 250 adolescents from around the world to develop a draft policy guidance on AI for children, which has 2 aims. The first is to raise awareness of children's rights in this space. And the second is to provide a set of recommendations for the development of child-centered AI, primarily for governments and for businesses. And the first version of the guidance was launched in September 2020. And after publication, we solicited additional input from a public consultation in which we received about 50 responses from civil society, from academia, governments, the private sector, and international organizations. And we also conducted a piloting process in which we had a diverse group of organizations test the guidance and provide their feedback through a series of case studies, which we published last year on a rolling basis. And based on this information, we updated the guidance and we released a new version in November 2021 with a pack of new resources, including additional guides for parents, for teens, tools for educators, and we also included the child and youth consultation methodology that we use to help formulate the guidance. Next slide, please. So the guidance consists of 4 chapters, including a section on children's rights, which explores how children are impacted by AI systems, and it outlines some of the key opportunities and risks through a series of use cases. And sort of the heart of the guidance is really the 9 high-level requirements that you see here to promote child-centered AI systems and policies. And these are based on the Convention on the Rights of the Child and are built on the foundation of protection, provision, and participation to also empower children. So yeah, here you can get a sense of some of the requirements, the need to ensure safety for children, protecting children's data and privacy, prioritizing fairness and non-discrimination. And with each of these requirements is a set of recommendations that can be adapted and applied to various sectors and contexts. So as I mentioned, in our effort to try to make the guidance as practical as possible, we worked with 8 public and private organizations, and they were from Sweden, Nigeria, United Kingdom, Japan, the US, and Finland. And each group piloted a different set of these requirements, essentially the ones that were the most pertinent to their policy or system, but they were ultimately all tested. Next slide, please. So here you can get just a glimpse of the collection of the case studies that we published. The projects that we had, they ranged from a virtual reality game in Nigeria to help caregivers and family members effectively communicate with autistic children, to updating, another case was updating a global retail company's responsible AI framework to include the needs and rights of children. So I just wanted to touch today on a couple of examples. I'll highlight the first 2 cases that we published, which are both from Finland. The first case is about a digital service called the Crime Detector System, which was developed by the startup called Somebody. Its founders are 3 women, a social media researcher, a lawyer, and a school counselor. And the system aims to help support children in Finland and in Sweden between the ages of 7 and 18 who have potentially experienced online harassment, particularly via social media. And social media platforms are in many ways considered an ungoverned space, or as the founders have called it, a Wild West. And oftentimes there's little recourse for someone who has been harassed or bullied online because they're unable to challenge the discrimination or abuse that they faced. And of course, this is particularly worrying when it comes to children. And the mission of Somebody is to provide children with a tailored legal assessment and psychological guidance when they're faced with online harassment. And through this AI-powered service that they provide, children are able to anonymously report incidents, including cyberbullying, threats, or sexual harassment by filling in a questionnaire. And then the system automatically analyzes the case with the aid of a human in the loop. So an actual person to provide legal supervision to identify, categorize, or diagnose types of online harassment. And then they provide victims with a criminal assessment and recommendations for next steps that they can take with the help of a parent or a guardian. And the team conducted an extensive literature review. They reviewed case law to define a legal approach and framework in accordance with the criminal law of both Finland and Sweden. They had an initial pilot phase from 2018 to 2019, where they assisted about 1,400 victims of online harassment. And as of last year, they were looking to expand the service to other countries as well. And the second case that I'm going to cover is about a chatbot called Millie, It was developed by the psychiatry department at Helsinki University Hospital. The service was launched as a pilot in 2019, and it provides users in Finland who are aged 12 and up with information about mental health. And very importantly, the chatbot was developed over several years with the collaboration of interdisciplinary experts, including psychologists, mental health experts, nurses, and AI and design engineers. And the chatbot allows users to anonymously ask questions about the mental health issues they may be facing. And the way that it works is that whenever a user goes to the hospital's website, the virtual assistant pops up in the right-hand corner of the screen with a friendly greeting, informing the user of two things. So one, that the assistant can help them receive mental health information and adequate support in a timely manner. And secondly, that Millie is a chatbot, so that the user is clear that they're not speaking to an actual person. And at the end of every interaction, the users rate the responses with a thumbs up or thumbs down. And throughout the design process, the chatbot was created and improved through an inclusive process, including adolescent end users. And this was actually a really fascinating case because they met with a group of students who were giving some feedback about the look of the avatar. And originally, Millie was designed as a teenager, to look like a teenager wearing a hoodie, to look sort of like a friend, like one of them. But after suggestions from the end users, the chatbot was redesigned to appear, to still look friendly, but to look like an unmistakably virtual assistant, right? So it was changed to look like a little floating figure. It was clearly a cartoon, so that there's no confusion when adolescents are interacting with the virtual assistant. And lastly, Millie was developed to understand that there are situations in which the support that it provides is insufficient. So in these particular situations, such as a user indicating intentions of self-harm or surpassing a threshold on a self-assessment tool for a mental health emergency, Millie will direct the user to an emergency service such as 112, so the European Union emergency number, or other health providers. Next slide, please. So in closing, while the AI project has officially concluded, UNICEF will continue to support this work through advocacy and awareness raising and help implement the guidance where possible. But actually in the next coming months, my team is working on related work. So for instance, we recently published a manifesto on better governance of children's data, which was a collaborative investigation into critical issues that children face with regards to data collection. And it was also meant as a call to action for governments and the private sector. And some colleagues of mine are also starting to investigate the impacts of neurotechnology on children. So another topic related to AI. And I've listed the project website so that you can view some of the publications that I mentioned, including the policy guidance, the case studies, outcomes from the regional workshops, and from the consultations with children. And then you can also find recordings from our webinars and some of our other events. And lastly, I've included my email here in case you have any questions further on, if you'd like to stay in touch, learn more about our upcoming work as it develops. Yeah, I'd be happy to answer your questions. Thanks so much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Melanie. That was really, really interesting. Gave a great overview of all of the work that you've been doing. So first of all, yeah, thank you to all the speakers for sharing their work. And as I say, if everybody would like to send through some questions, that's free. I might also start by taking advantage of the fact that I'm chair and ask some to get us started. So I guess one of the things, kind of building off what Melanie was talking about, which quite a few of you, including Micol, all kind of touched on, maybe less so Nayana, but I've got another question for you afterwards, is this thinking about how we design these systems and how we navigate making them appear as engaging systems that people want to use and interact with. Katie talked about introducing humor, for example, but that being guided by what the young people, how they identify that sense of fun or playfulness. And Nicole, Nicole talked about the fact that they found the way they related to the robot versus the conversational agent that wasn't embodied was distinct because of how it was conceived as a participant in it. And Melanie was talking a lot about with Millie, particularly the conversational chatbot, this distinction between making it apparent the limitations of what these systems can do for users to understand what functions they can perform and what they can't. So I guess any insights around navigating the ways in which you can make systems more usable, more engaging, and sometimes this may incorporate human-like functions, so be it in visual cues, but also in terms of the language they use, such as, you know, introducing humor or different types of linguistic constructions that may make it feel more naturalistic. How do you kind of navigate, or what has your research led you to think about how you navigate that distinction? So I don't know who would like to jump in with that first. Maybe
I can say something if you like. So I guess this is really interesting from a sort of ethical and responsible robotics point of view, because we are hearing there's a really prevalent like anti-anthropomorphism movement in robot ethics at the minute. So the idea that, you know, anthropomorphism is something that needs to be treated carefully, and that's on one side of the fence, whereas on the other side you have all these roboticists saying, yeah, but this is crucial, right? Engagement with the robot is absolutely achieved by creating these somewhat human-like personas. And I think what gets interesting from what we've seen in bringing children into the design loop is it doesn't ruin the illusion if they know it's fake, right? It does not ruin the effect of the robot if they know. In our case, actually, it was better when they knew that their friends were behind it. You know, it's not necessary to be deceptive in this way. And so I think if we can kind of follow this path a little bit more, we can find spaces where we are leveraging anthropomorphism, but it's not deceptive. And we are using their language, but that's because they have programmed it to do that, right? They own it, they lead it. And maybe that's a good way to navigate this space, so that we can do what you're saying, right? We can make sure we get the language right, whilst also making sure we're not under any pretenses. We're not, you know, artificially taking their language and using it to try and infiltrate their groups. It's really about kind of handing over that control. So yeah, I think the children themselves, young people themselves, are the only people who can really tell us that, and it's probably the way to navigate this difficult tension between the ethical side and the kind of necessity of anthropomorphism.
Sorry, thanks, Katie. That's really interesting. Micol, have you any thoughts in response to that?
Yeah, so I think that Katie, covered the main point. So to find out the good trade-off and the best trade-off between anthropomorphism and, you know, not to be too much, you know, human-like. So I think that also children sometimes, so from my experience, I have been doing also co-design study with children as well. And they are really, really simple. So sometimes we try to, you know, address very complicated gesture, human-like and so on, but from their perspective, maybe something more easier and some very simple action would be enough to keep children engaged during the interaction. So I think that is really important to keep children in the loop, to, you know, not overdo and over, you know, design our robots interaction, because for them it's even simpler. So like less is more sometimes. So I think that also in that respect, it's really important that we, you know, take into account their perspective, and we simplify also, you know, all the human-like behavior as much as possible, because it's unnecessary. I mean, sometimes they perceive it more, you know, creepy if it's too human-like. So I know it's like a trade-off, as Katie said before.
And Melanie, I think the case study that you were talking about probably particularly emphasizes there are particular use contexts, particular application areas, particularly for thinking about areas such as health and mental health, where really navigating those distinctions very clearly and identifying very upfrontly, these are the limitations, these are the things the system cannot do, this is something where we need to direct you elsewhere for help, but it can serve a different type of, can provide an interim measure or provide some information, but can't necessarily replicate speaking with a human being.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's a really good point. And I think that with the organizations that we worked with, we also tried to make sure that transparency was key, right? So just being very upfront with, this is the service, this is what it will provide. As you just said, these are the limitations, and also making it clear that it's a system that's continuously learning, right? So something that's going to be improved upon. But yeah, I think that for us, transparency is for sure one of our key requirements, and making sure that there are also accountability mechanisms that are put in place, so that if something does go wrong, there are ways to quickly remedy them. And I think a key part of these systems is also to not to cause harm, right? But just to try to serve as you say, like in kind of an intermediary to provide a service, but it's just a piece, right? It's just a piece of the solution.
Yeah, brilliant, thanks. I've got a question here for Nayana. Is there any work yet, or perhaps in progress, that you are aware of that looks at the long-term effectiveness of this sort of storytelling and misinformation combat strategies? For example, if this can prevent strategies for preventing radicalization later on in life, or yeah, anything related to storytelling in that aspect.
So I'm not especially familiar with with anything that's being published on that, and I think partly that's because it's something that needs to be deployed and used over such a long period of time. I do think that when it comes to issues like radicalization, for example, I think it's kind of more important to think about, okay, why do children actually go into that at all? Like and that's why I kind of mentioned in my presentation that I think ultimately, if children are living in an environment that's hostile towards them, or hostile towards their community, or feels like they feel alien perhaps in the society that they're part of, it's kind of more important for the governments and institutions and to think about why that is, and try and tackle that, I suppose, head on. I do think that like storytelling can have a really big impact, even in kind of identifying words like misinformation, disinformation, and media literacy programs try and do that. There are definitely quite effective ones, well, all across the world really, that try and identify that language so that children are at least familiar with what misinformation is, and don't just read something and think it's true right away, and try and go through questions in their mind before they begin to actually, accept something as the truth. But with specific topics, I think, for me at least, I think the kind of wider societal and environmental causes for that can be so significant that it's hard for anything to kind of cure that problem. It kind of has to be a wider and possibly a much longer generational issue as well.
Brilliant, thank you. So I guess one thing, well, first of all, I'll just say, if anyone, feel free to raise your hand as well if there are members of the audience who would like to ask specific questions. One thing I was going to say is you've all kind of talked about the importance of involving young people's voices into this process, or have worked on co-design projects. Do you have any insights or reflections on some of the things which perhaps either make this challenging? Are there particular like kind of practical guidance that maybe are useful things for people to bear in mind when you're working with children? These are some of the things you need to really kind of consider beforehand, where that might make it slightly different in how you approach it, or factors for how you ensure that you're engaging with a wide enough range of different children, because they're also, children are not one homogenous group. We know that age groups, we talk about designing for children, and we know that there's different levels of engagement, certain technologies, there's socio-cultural, economic factors that all play into this as well. So I wonder if any of you have any reflections on that maybe, or the practicalities of how you do this research and do it well.
So I can start. In my case, it was very, very challenging to design a co-design session with children with cognitive disabilities, because of course they have a lot of more difficulties in understanding any request that you are, prompting them. So it was really, really important in our case to support them with any visual material or any, demonstration of what we are talking about, because of course it's not a matter of asking them, okay, what do you like most, or like you have to show them, because otherwise they could not fully understand what you are referring to. So in my specific case, it was quite challenging because first of all, in the co-design session, we have always included therapists as well, because sometimes they have, they know the right channel of communication to be able to be understood by children. And they can, meet their needs, just behaving in a specific way that for us as a researcher would be very, very difficult to meet in the same way. So in our co-design session, we have always included therapists, and many times, they can also interpret children's behavior. And so they were like, okay, if he's acting like that, it means that he likes it, or vice versa. So I think that it's very, very important to keep, in my case, since they are children with cognitive disabilities, to keep, caregivers in the loop. So therapists or parents, but it's very, very necessary. Otherwise, the co-design session would be very, very challenging, and, as a researcher, would be difficult to understand and gather their perspective.
Thanks for that, Nicole. Anybody else have any reflections in relation to that or response?
Yeah, I could just add a couple. Oh, sorry, Katie. Thanks. I could just add a couple of quick points about our child consultations. So for us, it was important to work with local coordinators. So thinking about, how do you kind of work within the culture of the children that you're working with, making sure that you're speaking to them in, that it's not just in English, right? We have them all over the world. So for example, we had some consultations that were based in Chile, which were run in Spanish. So making sure that you're, speaking to the local language is also really important. And in terms of the structure of our consultations, we started out with a very brief overview, just because, kids are coming from different backgrounds, and we wanted to make sure to try to have, as much of an even playing field as we could. So giving a brief overview of what AI is, describing some of the very basic concepts, obviously without really trying to influence their opinion. So that's kind of a delicate balancing act. But then also conducting a mapping exercise so that they can start to think about their own digital footprint and, what are some of the services that they're using. For example, in the US, of course, a lot of the kids there were, much more familiar with their interactions with AI and with using algorithms, and, if they're watching Netflix or, they're using their phone, they're using, rideshare apps, things like that. Which were very distinct to kind of some of the more remote areas that we're working in. But nonetheless, I think that, in a lot of these times, we're working with kids who are very, who are just interfacing with technology all the time. So I think conducting that exercise was helpful to get them to think about, the impact of AI in their own lives. And then we also discussed with them some case studies, and just to try to prompt some of these to get them thinking about sort of these ethical questions about, what are some of the unintended consequences that could arise if, if it's up to an algorithm to decide who gets into a school, things like that, things that are very pertinent to their own lives and to their everyday. So those are some things that we found to be very helpful.
Great. And Katie, did you want to jump in?
Sure. Mostly just to echo a lot of the things that Melanie said. So firstly, on this local cultural thing, I think at the individual research level, we should just be honest about who our local culture is, and maybe be cognizant of what that is and state that up front. And so, I worked with English speaking young people in Sweden, which already comes with a load of connotations. So we did our best to recruit from a broad range of schools, and actually speaking English in Sweden can be a sign of being a newly arrived person. So actually it's not necessarily to do with wealth, or, it means different things dependent on where you are. So just being honest about that and saying, okay, I can't work with everyone, so I'm going to be honest about who my participants are and what that means, and just include that in my write-up, hoping that it helps other people, and then we can connect what we're doing a bit more globally that way, rather than us all trying to do it ourselves. And then I would say the second point, in terms of the practicalities, again, like what Melanie said, this study I did with the group assistant robot was 2 weeks. The first 2-3 days was just mutual learning, right? Getting them to do activities about multimodal communication, getting them to reflect on their own behavior, but really making time to listen from them as well. And demonstrating our credibility in that sense, that no, we are letting you guide this process. Like, we are really here to let you lead us, and trying to be doing that through transparency as well. So all the time, we're here as a summer school, we're going to teach you some things, but it's also a research study. We need to learn this, or want to learn this from you, and kind of, very genuinely making connections with the participants in that way. Taking the time to do that was crucial. And I don't think people from an engineering background are not so experienced with that. I've had to learn a lot to be able to do that, I think. So that's really practical skills that do need to be developed. And I think we have a lot to learn from the social sciences in how to conduct that sort of research.
I mean, maybe that's worth something just to pick up on. Are there any, how do we think about interdisciplinary research in this area? How do we integrate technical implementation, development of systems, while also simultaneously considering these factors? Is it the job of an individual researcher to perform these multiple different roles? How do we establish good collaborations that enable us to pull these different approaches? Or any thoughts or reflections based on your own experiences of maybe what needs to happen in the future to make this process or working to factor in these multiple kind of considerations better? No one wants to answer because it's a hard one, but
so I can jump on it. So from my experience, all my PhD was interdisciplinary, collaboration, and I'm very grateful for that, because without them, I don't think I could have been able to do half of the work that I've been doing during my PhD. I think that it's like very, very difficult to be the one single person that have all the skills and all the expertise in such a different field. So I think that it's important that every one of us has its own role, but it's very important that we learn how to interact with other people from different backgrounds to get the best from the collaboration. But I really believe in, research team, group, and multidisciplinary effort as well. And I don't think that an individual by him or herself could, give the same contribution as multidisciplinary group collaboration. So, and I have learned a lot. So, but on the same time, it's not enough. I mean, they advise all my empirical study design, they advise everything, how to design the activity, how to design the interaction, because we are, at least, I was looking everything from a more engineering perspective. So it was like challenging to understand their point of view as well. But it was very, very important and essential for the sake of the study.
Thanks. That's great. And I guess building on that, I know in Nayana's talk, you were, when we were talking about misinformation and the role of platforms, so as well as thinking about collaboration and exchange across disciplines, I think also maybe differentiating between different roles or different parts that the different actors in this space can play. I don't know if you've got any reflections on that.
Yeah, I think I do sit across different disciplines, and that the storytelling element comes a lot from my undergraduate and master's work, where I was actually in the English department, and then coming with that to a social science department is quite different. And I think the way people think of something, you know, I think people maybe are hesitant to think of humanities with the same level of value that they think of like STEM subjects or even social science subjects. So that's a real problem, I think. I think I'm always, you know, very clear that different actors play different roles, but we need these different actors to play roles. So government, institutions, individuals, but I'm very clear that I don't think individuals should be taking the bulk of work in things like misinformation. You know, so much comes from platforms. There's so much that platforms can do, and, you know, have been slow on the uptake. So platforms, government institutions, individuals, I think we're very fond of like putting a lot of onus on individuals to kind of fix problems for themselves. And I think we often word that as empowering people to find solutions or things like that. But it's not empowering when you've kind of inherited this very, you know, broken internet landscape, which is something that children have done. It's just, you know, it's not empowering at all. And I think that it's very clear that a lot of like larger organizations need to be taking responsibility and communicating with each other in a way that perhaps we're not seeing happen at the scale that should be happening at.
And I think that's, you know, some of the questions or the things that need scoping out in more detail at the moment. So if we think about, you know, what is harm? How do we define harm? Then how do we define that in a very specific use case in a particular technology? You know, what does that look like? How do we technically implement that? It translating from these, that there's, you know, what is harm, or how do we define that? That's not a traditional computer science research question. And yet then, you know, computer scientists, software engineers working on social platforms then have to operationalize what does harm look like, how does this message, does this flag as harmful content or not? And in the work in progress session before, we had some speakers talking about developing data sets where young people are flagging themselves. What are the risky messages, and how do we feed that into systems, and looking at the differences between what children themselves identify as risks versus what may be currently picked up in moderation systems. So I think, you know, there are different types of expertise that we need to bring together. But as you say, I think on the one hand, I'm always, you know, yes, we need to find ways that we're developing the AI literacy, the awareness, the young people have the capacity. We're working in a system where there is limited and reduced agency over how much control we have over systems, and yet we have enough knowledge that young people are in a position to start navigating and developing that criticality towards systems or how they engage. And so it's a really tough balance, I think. Are there any other questions? Because we are approaching the end of the session. And otherwise, I think I will thank the speakers. They were really, really fascinating talks. And yeah, I think it's given us all a lot to think about before the second session. So we will have a 30-minute break now. And when we return, the second session will be about the future of online safety. And Stephanie Ullman, my colleague, will be chairing that session. So please go take up the screen break, have a moment, get some water, some fresh air, and then rejoin us for 3:30 British Summer Time when the next session will start. But thank you so much. It's really, really been fascinating and yeah, really helpful. So thank you.